Welcome to the second Stopping the Spin response session hosted by the John Muir Project and collaborators. This series aims to address the misinformation and omissions present in the Forest Service's SCIENCEx fire webinars, offering a space for critical discussion and evidence-based perspectives that are absent from their presentations. Episode 2 of the Forest Service's SCIENCEx webinar series, Smoke, Smoke, and More Smoke, brought some notable shifts but left key gaps. While they challenged their earlier claim that forests need logging before fire, they omitted important details about the ecological and health implications of their practices, like the difference between prescribed burning and pile burning. No health experts addressed the dangers of ultrafine particulate matter, and ecological benefits of smoke were only briefly acknowledged. Our panel dives into these omissions and provides the clarity the public deserves.
Well, welcome everyone to the second in the Stopping the Spin webinar series that is addressing a series of presentations by the Forest Service on fire issues. And I'm once again reminded of the need for this webinar in response to the Forest Service. One, because the Forest Service process is appearing increasingly closed to public input. One standout thing about the webinar that just happened today, January 23rd, is that unlike their first webinar, they shut down the chat option. So in the first webinar, even though we weren't seeing challenging questions shared by the moderator during the discussion, at least in the chat section, there was a good exchange of information available to folks. That's gone now. I would also note, I think that their ostensible response to questions section was even briefer this time than last time. And again, challenging questions are not being presented to the panelists by the moderator. So very much a need for it. And today's presentation was about smoke, 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 and more smoke, was the title. And it's an important topic. And to me, it was really striking how much the Forest Service people didn't say on it and appeared not willing to sort of publicly and in a recorded manner say the things that are often conveyed informally to try and promote their policies. So I hope we're able to get into that, as well as correcting other, addressing the omissions and the misinformation within that webinar. So I will start off with the first of our three panelists, Chad Hanson. You want to introduce yourself and share some initial thoughts on that, on the Forest Service webinar?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'm Dr. Chad Hanson, Forest and Fire Ecologist with the John Muir Project. There's four things that really struck me about the presentation today from the Forest Service, the second in their SCIENCEx fire series. First one is what they didn't say. They completely backed off of their claim that they made repeatedly in the first of this webinar series, that somehow you need to thin the forest, in other words, log the forest before you can introduce fire, before you can do prescribed fire or any other type of fire. They made that claim repeatedly in the first one. That claim is completely false. There's half a century of published science, mostly by Forest Service and Park Service scientists, proving that that's not true. It doesn't matter how dense the forest is. You can burn if you want low or mostly low and moderate intensity fire, just do it in mild fire weather. That's the lesson. And so JMP has a fact sheet on our website that has a list of all those studies. So they didn't challenge that notion. They backed off on their earlier claim. So that was a significant reversal, I thought. The second thing that struck me was they talked about, one of their speakers, actually two of them, briefly mentioned that high intensity fire has a higher combustion efficiency than low intensity fire, but they never really talked about what that meant or the implications of that. So in other words, if you're doing low intensity prescribed burning, you're going to have a lower combustion efficiency. What that means is you're going to have a lot more particulates, the PM 2.5 particulates they express concern about, for a given tonnage of duff and litter or other vegetation that's consumed, relative to a ton of vegetation consumed in high intensity fire, which has much lower particulates. Now, you do get more consumption of vegetation in high intensity, but you have much higher particulates in low intensity. Bottom line is, when you do the math on it, you really have overall higher particulate production in low intensity acre per acre. They never really talked about that implication. And so I think to me, that was a problem. The other thing that they didn't talk about was the fact that a lot of the prescribed burning that the Forest Service is doing is actually not prescribed burning. It's logging / pile burning after thinning operations or post-fire logging operations. They bulldoze the branches and the treetops and the twigs into giant piles. They put accelerant on it and they burn those piles. They're trying to spin that these days as prescribed burning, but they're producing an enormous amount of particulates for weeks and weeks on end that otherwise just wouldn't combust even in a big fire. I thought that was a significant omission, and they really need to be honest about that. The last one was that one thing, just to make a positive statement, one of their speakers did mention that there are positive ecological aspects to smoke in ecosystems. Some plant species need smoke to germinate and things like that. So I thought that was nice. I'll give them some credit for that. Mostly I thought they just weren't being really honest about the fact that about some of the implications of prescribed fire. Not that prescribed fire is always a bad thing, and there's never a time or place for it. There is, right? But the last thing I'll just mention briefly is they weren't honest at all about the fact that in many areas, what the Forest Service is doing with its prescribed fire program is burning far more frequently than is natural in that ecosystem. They're burning on fire cycles that are 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 times more frequent than these ecosystems naturally burned before fire suppression, before management, before colonization. And that is producing enormous amounts of excess smoke, and it's not stopping wildfires anyway. You can modify them briefly for a short period of time, but it's not stopping them. And so I think that they need to be candid about that too. That was a huge omission.
Thank you, Chad. And just to reiterate one of the points you made about a brief highlight within that webinar that I appreciated too was the one panelist who spoke briefly to the ecological values and benefits of smoke for wildlife, for ecosystems. What stood out for me is that when she raised that point, that was something that was you could see it had been submitted as a question, but it wasn't one that was asked by the moderator. She brought that up on her own, to her credit.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
So our next presenter, Brian, would you like to introduce yourself and share your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks. I'm Dr. Brian Moench, president of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment, and I'm also the board chair of an international coalition, Doctors and Scientists Against Wood Smoke Pollution. Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment is one of the largest civic organizations of healthcare providers in the Western United States. And we specialize in knowing the medical research on air pollution and its health effects. I'd like to kind of begin with some comments that are perhaps existential in nature, and that is, so far these webinars conducted by the Forest Service presuppose that all of their research is to be taken for granted and is absolutely scientifically valid. Well, all of us on this panel have some real concerns about that assumption, and let me lay out why that's the case. The Forest Service mandate is to act as a facilitator for the logging industry, and historically they consistently played that role. It promotes timber and wood products with some rather stunning videos. It promotes the burning of wood for heat for homes, which, by the way, is the most polluting way possible to heat a home and the most carbon intensive, even more so than coal, while they simultaneously claim thinning the forest makes a healthier forest. Well, the agency also receives some of its funding from selling trees to the timber industry, so there's an obvious conflict of interest that is institutionalized within the Forest Service, and so it warrants suspicion. And I wanted to leave a couple of parallels as examples of things that would be considered outrageous by the public. If the FDA heavily promoted Prozac and received revenue from Prozac sales and published research showing its efficacy, the absurdity of that situation would be obvious. If the BLM made videos promoting quarter pounders and received a small percentage of Big Macs and published research showing that cattle grazing and beef consumption is good for you and the planet, a reasonable person would consider maybe that's not entirely above board. If the Department of Agriculture had a website that promoted Pop-Tarts, the public would have every reason to be skeptical of research funded by the Department of Agriculture that extolled the health benefits of Pop-Tarts and highly other processed foods. So we're in the same situation here with the Forest Service and the research they promote as calling for more and more prescribed burning and slash pile burning to promote healthier forests and to decrease wildfire risk. There is an inherent conflict of interest in all of that. Now, a couple of other things that I'll say before I shut up for a minute. There really were not health experts per se on that panel. There were some people who had a little perhaps more understanding of the health consequences of air pollution and in particular wildfire smoke than the average member of the public might have. But they really represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. If they understood it more, you would have heard a lot more about ultrafine particulate matter rather than PM 2.5. And the reason why that's the case is because there is an inverse relationship between inherent toxicity of particulate matter and the size of the particles. The smaller the particle, the more damage they can do because they can be inhaled more quickly, more easily. They're more difficult to exhale, the more easily they're picked up by the bloodstream. And once picked up by the bloodstream, the more easily they can penetrate tissues, including every single cell in the body. So in terms of systemic consequences, it's ultrafine particulate matter that is really the villain here, even though we use, for simplification purposes, probably the surrogate of PM 2.5. It's important to understand that ultrafines are really the villains here. And in addition to the size issue, the other reason why they are is because of the much larger surface area of these smaller particles. You have much higher concentrations of adhered chemicals and heavy metals that enhance the toxicity of the particulate matter. So unfortunately, there is oftentimes not much of a correlation between PM 2.5 levels and ultrafine levels. It is much more difficult to protect yourself from ultrafines. And so when these panelists talk about, oh, the public can protect themselves if they're given advance notice. Well, not really, because if you're even sequestered in your home and you don't go outside, there is not a home built in the world that is impervious to ultrafines. So that exposure continues regardless of what a person might do to protect themselves. I've got a lot more to say, but I'll turn it over to you and hopefully we'll address some more of the things that bothered me in terms of expressing the health consequences of this issue.
Thank you. Thank you. And then our final panelist, George, I will flag, George is in an area that's currently in a power outage. So he's participating via his cell phone. Hopefully that will continue to work through this presentation. So let me turn it over. George, can you introduce yourself and share some initial thoughts?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, the battery in my phone is going down, but we'll see how long it lasts. I have an organization called Public Lands Media, and I write a lot of what I write commentary on and follow is wildfires. And I try to visit wildfires and look and see how they burn across the landscape and under what circumstance. A lot of what is said, I didn't get to listen to the previous thing because of the power outage, but the Forest Service thing. But I'll talk about prescribed burning in general, some things to keep in mind. One, as has been mentioned by Chad, the ability of a prescribed burn to influence how fires burn is really short-lived, a few years at most, a lot of times, sometimes less. And under extreme wildfire conditions, which is, for example, what's happening in Southern California right now with high winds, the effect of doing prescribed burning in terms of affecting wildfire occurrence and spread is pretty limited. The wind will blow embers across any kind of barrier like that and spread beyond the fuel reductions that occur. And one of the things that was previously mentioned, but I want to heighten, is that when fires are burned at low intensity, as they ideally do during a prescribed burn, you get less combustion as opposed to the extreme wildfire weather, as Chad pointed out. But you wind up then having prescribed burns done in the spring and the fall, and then you still get smoke in the summertime. And one of the things that I find that's not sort of insincere about these claims is a lot of the smoke that communities experience in the summer comes from long distance transport. You can have a fire in British Columbia or in New Mexico and be living in, say, California or Oregon and get smoke in your community during summer. So you're doing prescribed burning during the spring and fall, and then you're still getting smoke in the summertime a lot of times, depending on the weather and the transport of the smoke by wind patterns. So that means that if you're sensitive to smoke and its effects, you're experiencing that much more of the year. The other thing about the prescribed burning that I have observed, and it's been shown in some research, is that sometimes you will get more biomass resulting. In other words, you go in and you burn an area, and then 2 or 3 years later, you have actually more tons of fuel, say grass or something, that comes back in. And so in a way, unless you burn it frequently, you are making the conditions for a subsequent fire worse, because you've provided more flammable fuel, the fine fuels that are most likely to burn. And as Chad also mentioned, and I'll give some examples, the agencies often use prescribed burning in ecosystems where it's totally inappropriate. In other words, the fire regime in a lot of these ecosystems much longer than a frequent fire, having a fire happen every couple of years. And as a result, you can actually eliminate the native communities. A good example would be sagebrush. Most sagebrush species in the West have a fire regime of 50 to 400 years or more. So if you come in there and burn them every couple of years, you introduce things like cheatgrass, which is more flammable, and you eliminate the sagebrush from the landscape. So the idea that this is an appropriate strategy to be used across the whole West is incorrect. In fact, the majority of plant communities in the West have longer fire rotations than every few years. They're often, as I mentioned, could be 50 to 1,000 years, depending upon where we're talking about. So that's an area where it's being promoted a lot of times incorrectly for the specific ecosystems. I guess that's a couple of my comments.
Thank you, George. Well, let me take two points from that to maybe delve into a little bit more. One that Chad referenced in the beginning is that one thing that really stood out for me in the Forest Service webinar there, in contrast to what we've seen from the Forest Service in a lot of other more informal contexts, is this message that says, oh, well, if you let us do this prescribed fire, you'll get less smoke exposure as a result of that. And that was sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink within this presentation rather than being said overtly. One thing that stood out for me was the closest it got was the lead smoke person on the panelists referred to reducing wildfire risk, but not reducing wildfire. He had to throw on this ambiguous modifier of risk. But I think from what I've seen, while there can be roles for prescribed fire, the claim that it's going to reduce people's overall exposure to smoke don't add up, and that in fact that there are ways that the large-scale application of it can lead to increased overall exposure to smoke and increased duration of exposure to smoke.
Exactly.
And in a process that sort of reminds me of something you were talking about last week, Chad, the concept of cumulative mortality. It seems like there's a sort of cumulative smoke from all the areas that experience prescribed fire that either don't burn soon after, or even those that do. As George pointed out, those areas tend to still burn and you get a second round of smoke. This treatment of it as, oh, do you want prescribed fire smoke or wildfire smoke, as though it's a choice of one or the other. It's not. Prescribed fire smoke is additive by and large. So I was wondering if anyone would want to add anything more to help the public be able to refute this when in other settings the Forest Service may try to either directly or indirectly make that claim.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is critical, right? So there's a time and place for, prescribed burning. It's not like it's never a good idea, but it's abused in many ways, and that's what needs to be stopped. And also there are a lot of times the agency, the Forest Service, tries to use it as a surrogate for wildfires that occur from lightning strikes, for example, and that's not effective or honest. So I would say, here's one example. Like if you have an ecosystem that naturally has mixed intensity fire, and high and moderate intensity fire are getting pretty close to natural historical levels, but low intensity fire is lagging behind. There are some situations like that. You could use prescribed fire to bring low intensity fire up. You could also do managed wildfire. You could also do Native American cultural burning in an area like that, if there's a history of cultural burning in that area. But what concerns me is the implicit message that somehow if we do a lot of burning and just kind of willy-nilly, just burn with prescribed fire, there was really no really discussion about controls or avoiding excess or anything like that. No discussion about natural range of variability. And if they're just doing that kind of burning, they're going to burn much more frequently than is natural, and they're going to dramatically increase smoke production, not just the total amount in a given year that communities experience, but also as George pointed out, the duration. It'd basically be all year, as opposed to 2 weeks here, maybe 2 weeks there, a couple of times during the summer. And I think that's a real concern. And I think it's a concern if the message is put out there that this is the antidote to wildfires and wildfire smoke. That is not a candid message to convey to the public. It's not honest.
Thanks. And then a second, sort of following up on that. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we are going to be living in a world that experiences a lot of fire and a lot of smoke. And as we just said, the Forest Service, with its prescribed fire programs, is not going to change that. Might even increase it. But that's going to be the reality. And another thing that stood out for me from the webinar, the Forest Service webinar, was how little they had to say about how the public can keep safe amid a world that's going to have more smoke. They talked a little bit about it in terms of wildland firefighter exposure. In terms of the public, it seemed like they were just more concerned about making sure that the public doesn't complain about their prescribed fire projects than what is actually going to keep smoke out of people's lungs, what's going to keep them safe. And one thing that I appreciated about the people on this panel is, in general, there's been an emphasis on the theme of the things that keep us safe are the things that are closest to home, that it's not about changing things across millions of acres of forest in terms of homes burning, that sort of thing. The most effective things are fire safe measures from the home outward. And it seems to me that there's potentially a similar pattern in terms of what's going to keep the public safe amid a world where there is inevitably going to be a significant amount of smoke. And the silence of the Forest Service on that point, the relative silence of the Forest Service on that point, I think speaks to the fact that they're not really in a position to address that. That's not where they operate. They have this strange role of trying to claim the fire and smoke issue, but they're not actually the agency in the best position to do the things that will do the most to keep the public safe, both in terms of homes burning and in terms of smoke exposure. So I was wondering if any of you could share thoughts about what are the things that the public can do during inevitable smoke events to help reduce their exposure.
Can I make again some existential comments that struck me having sat through 2 of these webinars now? The Forest Service is very skilled in the language of euphemisms. Terms like logging and thinning and clear cutting and chainsaws and burning, they all carry very disturbing connotations. So you will notice that Forest Service personnel always instead use comforting or even medical terms like prescribed, like treatment, like fuels reduction, habitat enhancement. They throw out sustainable constantly, resilient, good fire, overstory removal. These are all either medical or comforting terms or sterilized terms. They never talk about bulldozers. They employ instead mechanical fuels treatment. So when they conduct outreach to the public and try and convince them that prescribed burn smoke is something they just have to put up with, they couch it in these euphemistic terms, and that gives them an advantage, and they've been very good at doing that. But there are no euphemisms that change the medical research, which shows every bit of air pollution exposure that a person is subjected to causes harm. And in fact, one of the concepts that was completely missing from their presentation today was the relationship between air pollution exposure and health consequences is not linear. It's actually hyperbolic, meaning at the very lowest doses, the dose relationship curve between concentration and the health outcomes is the steepest. And that's reflected by research that shows that smoking 1 cigarette a day is virtually half as much risk as smoking an entire pack. So when these government officials say, well, our object is to either get smoke levels below the national ambient air quality standards, or you have to put up with a little bit of smoke because our smoke's better or more benign, they fundamentally don't understand the medical research on what air pollution does to people. Within 15 minutes, we can see these tiny particles that you've inhaled in your urine affecting your kidneys. And we can see that for 3 months. And so when one of these panelists says, well, what's really counting here is concentration and duration of exposure, that's not true at all. Those things are important, but more important than that is probably timing, depending on who's exposed. If it's a fetus in its mother's womb, 1 day of a prescribed burn can have a profound impact on the integrity of organ development that will affect that person's life forever. So there are things that they're trying to convince the public of that are not supported by the medical research. And the idea that, well, you can plan your activities to avoid the smoke from a prescribed burn, whereas you can't plan your activities to avoid wildfire smoke. That's just not true at all. And one other comment to follow up on what Chad said, they talk about more intense wildfires as if that's actually worse for you. But in fact, those higher temperature situations probably put out less PM 2.5 per mass or per pound of biomass burned. But here's one thing they don't talk about. It's very well established that lower intensity temperatures produce more dioxins. Dioxins are the most toxic chemical in the environment that we know of. And fires are the third most important source of dioxins for the average person. So prescribed burns are actually putting out more of some of the most toxic chemicals than these higher intensity wildfires, if you were to try and force to compare the two. So they're not being fully honest about that. Maybe they don't know it, but those are the kinds of things that the public needs to know in terms of what can I do to protect myself.
I'm going to add a little bit in on that. It's somewhat related. I lived in a town in Montana that had a burner established to burn garbage, and to sort of make your point, Brian, when they would start up, the temperatures were lower, and they put out a lot more particulate into the air. And then when they finally got it operating at full heat capacity, at least we were told, that there was less toxic materials coming out of the smokestack because of the higher temperatures. And but one of the deceptive things they gave is they told the community that you don't have to worry because we're going to burn at high temperatures. This kind of gets back to biomass burning that they're pushing also in places. But the startup and the shutdown would put out way more particulate per unit burned at these lower temperatures than at the high temperature. So it sort of makes your point about the wildfires burning in the extreme weather often are burning up a lot more of those particulates that might be dangerous.
George, that is true of incineration, regardless of what the substrate is.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the most
Right.
most important and the highest volume emissions and the worst chemical profile is during the startup phase,
Right.
the lower
Right.
combustion phase.
That's right. That's what I learned about them at that thing. And in fact, this incinerator would start and stop frequently. And we started monitoring it for that reason. It was in violation of the state codes constantly. And finally it got shut down.
I'll just add one quick thing to this discussion, just to put it in perspective. What we're talking about here. One of the concerns. So there's research from the U.S. Forest Service's own scientists, showing that, for example, in the mixed conifer forests of the western Sierra Nevada, that after a low intensity prescribed fire, the combustible vegetation that actually drives flames, grasses, shrubs, seedlings, etc., the kind of what they call fine fuels, the things that actually can burn and carry flames, that reaccumulates to almost pre-prescribed fire levels within 2 years, and by
Right.
3 years after prescribed fire, it exceeds the level that occurred before the prescribed fire. So 3 years later, you actually have 2 years later, you almost have the same amount as you did before the prescribed burn. 3 years later, you have more, and so in these same ecosystems, these same forest types, the Forest Service's research and most other research shows that historically fires would have burned on average, every 25 to 40 or more years. And of course, it was highly variable, but that was kind of an average, depending upon whether it's dry mixed conifer or moist mixed conifer. So you're talking about if your goal was to prevent a wildfire, prevent a higher intensity fire by controlling those grasses and shrubs and seedlings, you would have to burn every year or every year and a half, or to have any effect at all. Whereas you'd have to burn at least 20 to 30 times more frequently than the natural fire regime. And again, you're talking about particulates and tree mortality, potential for escape every time. And so, this is not a strategy to prevent wildfires or reduce smoke. Having said that, again, there is a time and place for prescribed fire. There are reasons, but it's not about preventing wildfires or controlling smoke. And they need to be honest about that. There are ecological reasons, but they have nothing to do with logging, and they have nothing to do with smoke production. or reduction, and they have nothing to do with stopping wildfires.
One other point. Oh, excuse me.
Go ahead.
One other point to get at this whole thing about fire rotations is that a lot of the studies that they use to justify frequent fire are use methodologies that some have criticized. For example, they use what's called a composite fire chart or accumulation of looking at all the years that they can document that a fire left a scar someplace. And it could be just one tree burned in lightning, but that's added into the composite of the years of fire and gradually shrinks the frequency down. So that's one of the problems with the fire scar methodology for coming up with what was the fire sequence in any particular area. The other thing is you're somewhat biased in going out. You wander through the woods looking for trees that have scars, and that isn't every tree out there. And so you're pre-selecting, not at random, but you're selecting trees that are likely to have been scarred. So people should be aware that a lot of the fire scar studies that are are used a lot of times to justify fires and how frequent they are, have problems that some criticize as being invalid and tend to shrink the fire frequency so they can justify more fire burning.
There are a couple things that I think we ought to mention that the Forest Service clearly did not, and that is what these mechanical or prescribed burn treatments of the forest do is they often provide an opening for invasive grasses to move in.
Right.
I just read a study that there are 6 different invasive grasses in the West now that have been tied to about a 150% increase in fire frequency compared to uninvaded places. And in fact, one invasive grass in Oregon, and I can't pronounce the name, this study calculated that it had created fuel loads 50 times greater in the area where that invasion has taken place compared to where those areas free of that invasive grass. And the other thing they never talk about is what do the roads required to conduct these prescribed burns and thinning and slash pile burning, what do the roads do to the forest themselves and the wildfire risk? Something like 89% of wildfires are human caused. Almost all of those are near a road.
Right.
And the roads obviously have profound ecologic implications, but they increase human contact with the forest. And if humans are the main driver of wildfire occurrence, then that in and of itself increases wildfire risk.
Exactly. And also the roads become linear corridors for weed establishment, things like cheatgrass and other flammable grasses by the creation of the roads. So that's another, indirect effect of the roads is not only that people are driving those roads, but it also helps to spread the weeds throughout the whole forest ecosystem.
Yeah, and a little bit of context here on how those invasive grasses get to these places. They're either typically brought in by logging machinery in these logging operations that they euphemistically call thinning before they do the burning, which they, again, is really slash pile burning after the logging, but these days they try to spin it as prescribed fire. It's one of the abuses of prescribed burning that's going on right now by the Forest Service. So that's a vector. That logging machinery is a vector for the introduction of combustible invasive grasses. One of the other ones is fire suppression. The fire suppression machinery during a fire that they use introduces the seeds of the invasive grasses. And then, of course, post-fire logging is another one, and all the logging machinery. So what they're doing is basically introducing, in the context of their fire management, highly combustible invasive grasses in multiple ways.
I just looked up one of those studies that said 95% of human-caused wildfires, which is obviously the bulk of them, occur within a half a mile of road.
Right. Exactly.
And and another study that said over 53% more wildfires occur within 200 meters of a road than you would expect if just by random distribution.
Yep.
And I've never heard anybody from the Forest Service, and I've listened to these two presentations. I've listened to some of our local people. Nobody ever talks about that from the Forest Service.
I think
Yeah,
these are all
that's
important points, and ones that were, as you all have highlighted, have been missing from, have been omitted from the Forest Service presentations. So I just wanted to check in. Is that a good wrap-up point, or is there anything else that folks would like to add for this particular discussion today?
I
Well,
think that's a good wrap-up point. Go ahead, George. Sorry.
I just wanted to highlight one more thing about the roads. There's also studies that show that the clearing of the vegetation for the roads, it becomes a, I don't know how best to describe, a corridor for heat. In other words, preheating the vegetation on either side because it's open to the sunlight, and then the especially if it's the heat is rising along the edges of those roads, it actually increases the likelihood of ignition on either side of the roads. So,
Can I just make one other comment? Again, from a 30,000 foot perspective. None of us, but especially the four of us, Forest Service, talk enough about the climate implications of these strategies. I mean, very simply, just about anybody can understand. You cut down a tree, immediately you end its carbon absorption capability, you put it in a slash pile and burn it, and within a day, that carbon's now gone into the atmosphere. The climate scientists have told us now repeatedly, we have a window of maybe now about 5 years left to avoid these irreversible catastrophic tipping points. So whatever we do in terms of the carbon equation in the next few years is all important. So even if you could justify a forest mechanical treatment strategy based on it reducing overall atmospheric carbon 30 years down the road, but you have to accept it's going to increase atmospheric carbon right now, you have to abandon that strategy if you believe in the climate scientists.
That's a good point, and the scientists who have looked 30 years down the road have drawn the conclusion that it's a net significant net increase in carbon emissions, even if you look at a 30-year time frame too, if you're doing thinning and other logging and burning logging and slash burning activities.
I want to add one more comment to highlight that. A couple of things. One, they've shown in Oregon that the wood products industry contributes to 35% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state, more than the transportation, jets, and all that in the state of Oregon. So it's a significant amount of release of carbon that happens with wood products production and thinning and so forth. The other part of it is people may not realize what burns up in a forest fire is the fine fuels, as was mentioned earlier, the needles, the grasses, the small branches. And after a fire, you have snags left, which store still a lot of carbon and in the roots and carbon in the soil. So the loss of carbon that occurs during wildfire is significantly less than when you go and log it and take away those trees and do whatever you do with them, burn them or make them into wood products or whatever. So it's important to realize that the way a natural fire occurs, though it will release emissions, is usually less than what you get with the logging operation.
Yeah, far less.
I think in one sentence you can say that fuels reduction treatments, to use their euphemism, is simply climate malpractice.
Yeah.
If you believe in the science, you have to believe that the climate scientists know this issue best, and they say we've got 5 years left. So this is climate malpractice, not to mention whether or not it's public health and forest malpractice.
Yep.
I think that's an excellent way to summarize this panel, and I want to thank you all for all of your insights and for everything you're doing on this issue. So with that, why don't we end the session and encourage people to come back next week for the next round of this.
All right, see
Bye,
ya.
everybody.
Bye.